Hello, welcome to Gwent. Let's have a talk about fun and deck archetypes. Well, first of all, what makes a meta good? What makes it fun? Is the current meta better than the last? Most would say it is, and the one before was any good? And the one before, how do we know? There needs to be some kind of measure, and most would say, because we're gonna use examples, that variety is definitely a good thing, because you don't want one deck just saying like, give me your lunch money, and they'll just, I just wanted to have fun. So that doesn't work, of course. So you need to have some variety, but I would argue, well, it's basically a fact at this point that Dagon is owning everybody except maybe the dwarfs currently on the ladder. Yet most would still say, apparently, that the meta is more fun. And why could that be? Maybe they're playing Dagon, and they love owning people. But let's just look into the deck types. What can be considered, like how do they play? I think that very much comes down to how fun the meta is. So this is just something guys slapped together. I don't really play this crap. So this is a strong dwarf. You basically see this all the time on the ladder. In the top 10, it's popular. So, what's the thing here? So let's just say, well, you can have 25 cards. We also have 8 nay. We consider that the 26th. So we have this units here, and every single one of them only interacts with your own board. So that makes the deck rather easy to play and also very uninteractive. It is boring, like at least I would consider it boring, but it could be okay for a good play, a new player, or maybe just someone who really likes to win. And there are other deck types who play this way. For example, Consume Monster likes to play similarly. Of course, you don't have to go like completely, completely reliant on your side, or not really reliant because you kind of like dictate how you play. But you don't have to go like 1% in this direction. You can add in some interaction with your enemy, but that is rarely the choice, and that's not how exactly these dwarves play. But ultimately, it's kind of boring, I would say. But of course, if these kind of decks that like only interact with their own side, get out of hand, like this is boring. But if these decks are strong, like the Consume Monster was strong in the closed beta, the meta is extremely boring. So you don't want that. So this is just one example, and it kind of shows that, yeah, you can have this, it's pretty strong. We just see that if I would give that deck an interaction value, I would give it a 0 out of 26, but it actually doesn't deserve a 0 because it still plays units, and the units can be interacted with by the opponent, and that's still an important factor because this deck, Magic Broccoli, not really played in the current meta, but it was pretty popular in the previous meta, and I would argue still it's playable. Maybe it's limited to tier 2 now, but you can definitely still play it. So what do we see here? Now it's completely turned around. We see that almost all the cards interact with the opponent, and ultimately the finishing, and actually golds are special. They cannot be interacted with unless with special card like D-Bomb Shackle, so these cards cannot be interacted with, so they are counted as such. Only these cards can be interacted with, and they are almost always played very, very last. So the usual finisher is like first light the Doblatana, then and Italy in the first lights 2 Doblatanas along just as a finisher. And that's it. Other than that, it's just a non-stop spamming control. And it is actually more fun to play than to play against, because if you actually go up against this deck, it might seem like, oh yeah, that's a lot of interaction, but it cannot be interacted with, because at the very last, you might have some guys who you can interact with. If you have the proper tools to deal with that. But it might not be enough, because if your opponent plays last with it lean, then if he gets the last say, then he can just get out, just go like it lean, first light, double do platana. And yes, that sucks. And you might not, even if you have the answer, I don't know, like a Scorch to deal with the do platanas, you can't use it because you don't have the chance to act first or last, I mean. So again, this leads to more problems, because if you want to interact with this deck, you can't do that. Same problem with the golds. Golds cannot be interacted with, and many times many players like to save the golds for last round, for a very disappointing last round, I would say, because it basically comes down to like, hey, I spent my golds, what you got? You don't have the golds, I'm gonna win. And of course, in a way, saving your best cards for last, if you can help it, is smart, but then it basically makes the last round more like a dwarf turn. Like, you just do your own thing, and if your opponent has gold cards, then he does his own thing as well. So makes the last round pretty damn boring. So I don't particularly like that the gold cards cannot be interacted with. Not a huge fan of that. I get it. I guess it makes them unique in a way, but still lame. So that's about it. The other thing is that if you try to interact with this deck, again, it doesn't work. So this deck actively discourages control. So if for example this deck got out of control, then the best answer would be an extremely uninteractive deck. You would need to run something like a dwarf, just interacting with your own board, and that's pretty lame. So if the top meta deck, if this was a top meta deck, would force you to be very boring, that would be extremely disappointing, at least I would say. So again, the reason why I brought up these decks is because these are extreme examples. Like extreme control, this is not the only one. This is not the only one, and not like these decks just like magically made out of nothing. These archetypes are set up by the developers. So, well, I wouldn't really like say that they completely intended them to be played in such a way, but yeah, it's kind of how it makes sense. Whenever you play a special card, boost this unit by 1 bar in hand, they agree your side of the board. So it gets stronger by 1 every time a special card is played. And it doesn't have a cap. For example, if it was like, gets stronger by 2 every time a special card was played, up to 5 special cards, then this guy would be like a guy who makes sense in a spell deck. But that's not how it works. It is a guy that makes sense in a lot of spells deck. And the only reason it really makes sense. And I would argue, such a deck is really not too fun to play against. To play as, it's not that bad. But to play against, it really sucks. And it does limit, and it might seem like, oh yeah, but it has like a little bit of back and forth. But it doesn't have, because there's nothing to have a back and forth with. And it does still limit. It is still a very easy to play deck, but on the other end of the spectrum, because you don't have to consider your own board at all. You don't get screwed, you have nothing. And that's not how what your win condition is. So again, these extreme decks, I would say kind of lame. I don't particularly enjoy playing them. I'm partial to like hybrid decks, or more like balanced decks. Like, you have power and you also have control. And for example, this deck is like that. For example, this would be the best example. One of the best examples. You play something on your board that can be interacted with, but you also interact with your opponent. So this guy gets full marks for being fun. Maybe that's not how I should call it, but let's just call it interactive. Because he can be screwed over, and he also screws the enemy over. That's pretty good, and this whole deck is loaded with cards like that. And of course, not every single one, like Thunderbolt Potion and Cillian and Harpy, only your board, but we also have cards that only enemy board. Because these cards are very impactful. This is just general, but definitely aiming with the enemy board for that one. With that one. Yeah. And that's it. So you see, like, I would say, like, you definitely don't want to encourage the extreme end of the spectrum, because that kind of leads to boring games. And many of the archetypes are just too extreme. For example, the Baron deck, again, kind of like encourages that, but it's not exactly in that extreme way. It's not exactly like the spell scoia'tael was in the last patch, definitely. But it does still encourage that, hey, I'm just gonna play very little and try to just murder you all the time. And I guess that still kind of makes sense. Because, I don't know, I don't want to see, like there's nothing really wrong with these kind of decks. But I feel like they really shouldn't be that viable. Because I think that's what the devs are trying to do. Like, hey, if you want to play a deck that only does its own thing, you can do that. Or if you want to play a deck that only screws over the enemy all the time, you can do that. But I would argue you can't do that. You can't have a deck being competitive, being tier 1, that screws over the opponent, because that ruins the meta. That means no one can play control because there's a guy out there who cannot be controlled ever. And if you play control, all your control spells are gonna be useless. And you're gonna get crushed by in that matchup. Or maybe not, who knows. But probably you can beat his crazy finisher. And again, when it comes to this deck, this is kind of like boring to play against. He just does his own thing. He never interacts with you. And it's all about just points. Because the thing is, unlike many other card games, it might seem like, oh, there's nothing wrong with like a 5 strength dude and a 6 strength dude. But in other card games, the minions usually do fight. But in this card game, no. You just put down points. Your opponent puts down points. And that's it. If the two dwarf decks fight, it's all about who gets luckier, who goes first and loses. Whoever goes second, or whoever gets luckier, basically wins the game. That's basically it. They just all about just going for maximum efficiency, and they're not screwing each other over. Even if there are cards to screw with the dwarves, and I do want to make this point. Like, let's go with Dreaded Tears. So this deck is tacked against dwarves. We do have backers that punishes big buff units. We also have, well, Lacerate is more of a, well, it's not really tacked against the dwarves, but it's still okay against the dwarves. But the card that is tacked against the dwarves, because they are that strong, is Marigold Hailstorm. So I basically have two cards that just all about just to get the dwarves. Marigold Hailstorm again hits all units because they go in a row. And the D-Bomb actually got nerfed from 5 units to 3 only. So currently it's just, I don't know. It doesn't really feel good to include. And again, I want to make 1 point. Because we have D-Bomb here. It might seem like, oh yeah, this could be really good against the dwarves. But the thing is, what I really want to make with the control options is that you gotta consider their average value. Because when you play I don't know, when you play something like, something dumb like, let's just say, can we just find some unit that let's, no. No. They completely got rid of the vanilla units. That just has nothing else to it. But let's just say you play like a dwarf, you know? You never intend to buff it up, you just get 5 strength from it. That's all you get. And that's the average value of it. You get 5 strength, and next round you're gonna get 5 strength, assuming there is a next round. Now, the thing with these control options is that their value does vary quite a lot. So you might just wanna think like, oh, we have this options like Arachis Venom. This is awesome. I can hit the enemy for 12. Pretty sweet. Why wouldn't I use this? Well, because trying to find 3 enemies that you can hit for 4 each is a lot harder than finding 3 allies that you can buff for 4. And I would love to use Arachis Venoms, but realistically, you gotta use Thunderbolt potions because this is a condition that you can fulfill yourself, and Arachis Venom would be far less valuable a lot of the time. And that's why control options are very tricky to include. And you really don't want to overload your deck with it. And that kind of comes back to the Dimeritium Bomb, because, for example, Lacerate could have the minimum value of 0 and the maximum value of... Actually, this doesn't have a maximum value, but I would say it's like, it can have like 20 plus in the right matchup, and even the average value of like 9-ish. So it's really not that bad of a card, and can be crazy good, but it can be pretty dead in, for example, in a control Radovid matchups. And the reason why I'm not using Dimeritium Bomb over Marigold's Hailstorm is because of this uncertainty of the card. Because if I was going up against someone who doesn't buff at all, and this card would worth a fat 0, unless because we can also use it to heal. But let's just say I didn't even get hit and the enemy didn't buff up. Whatever matchup that is. But my point is, the point I'm making here is that there's a value floor, the minimum you can expect from it, and a ceiling. So, of course, if you just debomb the fattest dwarfs, this is great. But realistically, that could work. But you might not find great targets other times, and that's what makes it harder to include. But Marigold Hailstorm is actually a little bit different. It could, the ceiling is definitely potentially lower than it is with the Dimeritium Bomb, but can I just get the not noisy version? Looks like I don't have it. I just gotta stop clicking on it. And the ceiling is definitely lower in most cases if you're just trying to shut down really buffed up dwarves, but the floor is also higher. You can use this as kind of like a Lacerate in many cases, and you can just have another Lacerate in your deck. Of course, we have another Lacerate as well, because in this meta, people really like having stuff on the board, and you're just gonna slice it up all the time. Again, Commander's Horn is very easy to set up yourself. But, like, there's a silver card that nobody has. It's basically the Arachis Venom for 5. That is useless. And that's kind of a problem, because control options many times just not strong enough. Even if that Arachis Venom hit for, like 5 units for 6, would it be OP? Would it be just too strong? Even if it, like, maybe, would anyone use it? Maybe they would use it as a 6. Would they use it as a 5? Probably not. It would suck as a 5. Would Arachis Venom see use as a 5? Maybe. Maybe it would see use as a 5. But as a 4, it's just too situational. And the point I'm making, the control options could be less situational, because that actually makes the boring, just value efficiency decks get out of control. But also we don't want the control decks to get completely out of control. So it's a tricky to balance. But I don't necessarily want to see extreme decks like, hey, I'm just a dwarf. Like, on the other hand, we have the dwarf that just does his own thing. And on the completely other extreme side, we got the scoia'tael that only screws you over. And I feel like more in the middle. I think it's where the true fun is to be found. At least that's my take on it. For example, if I could, that's what I would go with. That's what I found fun in other card games as well. A good mix of like control and like units that just like, you know, can be shut down, and they do have effects themselves, and you can have a lot of fun with that. Of course, this is kind of like my personal preference, and the thing is, I don't know. There are, first of all, we want to see variety, because and the only way you really have variety is that you really like, they kind of enable more type of decks. But I do want to see, like, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with dwarves, but if they get out of control, It's lame. But the reason... No, I'm really glad that I remember that. This deck, for example, getting out of control, is not as lame. Because this is actually fairly interactive. You interact with your opponent, he interacts with you, and this is actually a good fight. In my opinion, this is just entirely my opinion, this is actually a pretty good fight. Because, yeah, you have units, your opponent has units, this is a very interactive fight. It would be like dwarf against dwarf, it would be like consume monster against consume monster, or scoia'tael versus scoia'tael. It would be the lamest thing ever. And that's kind of like a bad thing about the extreme decks. So more in the middle is what we want to see, or at least what I would like to see. Anyway guys, that's all I had for now. I'm very curious what you guys have on the topic. Also very curious what the devs will come up with in the future. Because currently the meta is pretty Dagon dominated, yet most would say, hey, it's pretty fun. And I would say it's pretty fun. Of course I see those stupid dwarfs, I need to cut them down, kill them all. But other than that, everyone is a chump. We can kill them easy. So that's about it guys. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.